We're really excited to welcome John Sculley to the iHub in Nairobi. The iHub is the innovation hub. We started out in 2010, and this is a really important series because over the years we've had everyone from Bob Collymore to Vince Cerf to Joey Ito as part of the Fireside Chat series. So we're very honored to welcome you. And this is how it works. For the first 45 minutes or so, we will hear directly from John Sculley about his journey as an entrepreneur, as a CEO, and also about his books, his basically what brought you to where you are today, and perhaps a little bit about Obi Mobiles, and we'll have a few questions at the end of that. But really, this is a chance for us to learn from you, and perhaps also for the audience to engage with you. And who among you know who John Sculley is? You looked up the profile, yeah? Brilliant. And we'll dive right into it. Again, as you think about the questions that you'll be asking, we're really excited to talk about global expansion. How do you take a company from 800 million to 8 billion? How do you get into new ventures? And basically, whatever questions you have, please start jotting them down, and then we'll try and get to them, to as many of them as possible tonight. So I'll turn it over to you. Welcome again, and please feel free to just tell us your story, you know, and some of the things that from your book. What is one or two things that, for those of you, so those of us who have not read your book, what one thing do you want us to remember? Because a lot of people here are entrepreneurs. They're just starting out or are part of teams of growing companies, and they really, some of them have global ambitions, some of them have regional ambitions, and they're just starting to get out there in a very different context, in a very different environment, but I'm sure there's some things that translate globally. So welcome, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Juliana.
Here, use this one.
This one's on? Good. Well, you've had some amazing speakers here, and it's really been an incredibly interesting day for me. I just arrived last night with my wife from the United States, and we have really enjoyed ourselves so far, and it's been a great pleasure meeting Juliana and seeing the brick. I'd already heard about the brick ahead of time before I met Juliana, because I had lunch earlier with Bob Collymore, and he was telling me about you and how impressed he was with the brick and what you have accomplished. And I guess it all came out of Ushidito originally, and so it was a spin out from the nonprofit project, and we just visited that downstairs. But let me give you kind of things that have been really impactful to me in my life, because I am an entrepreneur. And I come from the high-tech world of Silicon Valley. And I have worked all over the world, particularly in developing markets. And if I think of something that would be a really important message for you to take home, it goes back to the early days in Silicon Valley, when Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and I would sit around at nighttime and talk about things that they were dreaming about, things where they thought the computer industry would go. And we're going back to the early 1980s. And here's what's really interesting. In all of the conversations we had together, and they were 27 years old, so about maybe the age of some of you. They were 27 years old. The computer industry as we know it today was just in its earliest days. The microprocessor was just becoming powerful enough to actually build personal computers. My good friend Steve Wozniak, who had invented the personal computer, had never been able to afford his own computer, so he would go to the Stanford Library and he would look up the patents of the large mainframe and mini computers, and he would design his own computer. Because he's a genius, he would design it on paper because he couldn't afford to buy the components. There was no such thing as a personal computer. And when he created the first Apple II, he did things that had never been done before, but he had curiosity and he had the interest in adapting technology to make it affordable for something that he aspired to. And what I learned from those conversations with Bill Gates and Steve Jobs in the early days, none of us ever talked about making money. It was always about the noble cause. And the noble cause that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and Bill Gates, all of these young entrepreneurs had in those early days was to empower the knowledge worker. The knowledge worker was a term that had been introduced some years earlier, but there wasn't really a knowledge industry when it was first introduced by Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker became the most famous business strategist in the world, and he had introduced this idea of a knowledge worker and the concept of the information age almost 20 years earlier than the beginning of the personal computer era. So when he suggested the idea of an information age and a knowledge worker, most people had no idea what he was talking about. But Steve Jobs and Bill Gates did, and they were inspired by it. And so their noble cause was to create a tool for the mind, a computer that could be the enabler for knowledge workers to become personally productive. And if you look back to the information industry over the last 35 years, every technology company has pretty much followed the same mission of giving knowledge workers better and better tools to increase their personal productivity. Didn't make any difference whether it was Intel making chips, or Microsoft making software, or Cisco making networks, or Apple, making its personal computers and other devices. It was always about empowering knowledge workers with better and better tools. The other part of the vision that Steve Jobs and Bill Gates had as their noble cause was that they wanted to create something that was affordable for people. And so Bill Gates invented what we know today as shrink-wrap software. There was no such thing as shrink-wrap software in the earliest days. In fact, all of the profit was made from the hardware, and the software was given away for free before personal computers. And the third idea in their noble cause was to change the world one person at a time. Now, I had come to Silicon Valley from an entirely different world. I'd been in corporate America. I'd been the CEO of a world company named Pepsi-Cola. And the way I had been trained to think about business was it was all about competition and what was known as the Cola Wars. So it was thinking of business in the context of an industry that had boundaries to it. And it was like gladiators in a ring competing with one another. To win, you had to take away something from your competitor. When I came to Silicon Valley and listened to Steve Jobs and to Bill Gates, I realized that's not what they were thinking at all. Their world had no boundaries. Their world was all about empowering knowledge workers, individuals, and changing the world one person at a time with new kinds of information technology tools. Now, while Steve Jobs and Bill Gates completely agreed on the noble cause of what they were trying to build, they totally disagreed And they fought all the time over the strategy of how to do it. And so I would be there with them. They were the geniuses. I was really just the lucky observer. And because I was then CEO of Apple. I'd been recruited to Apple to help take it to the next stage. And Steve Jobs' view was that it was all about creating tools for non-technical people. Back in those early days, computers were only for technical people. You had to be a trained technologist, a trained engineer to know how to use a computer. They were very, very expensive. You know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars for a computer. The idea that someone would have their own computer was crazy. And that's why Steve Wozniak had to go to the Stanford Engineering Library and look up the patents to find out how the mini computers and mainframe computers were built so that he could eventually build a personal computer, because there was no such thing in those early days. So Steve Jobs always said he wanted to control everything. He wanted to control the software, he wanted to control the hardware, he wanted to keep it proprietary. The first Macintosh, you couldn't even get inside of it. It was a lock box that took a special tool. There was no way for anyone to get inside because he didn't want anybody messing around inside the box and modifying it, because he wanted it to be exactly the way he created it. Bill Gates was completely at the opposite end of that vision. And Bill Gates said, it's all about creating an open system, and it's all about software. So Bill didn't care about the hardware. He said, I will license my software operating system. In those days, it was called MS-DOS, before Windows. I'll license it to anybody who wants to build a computer. And he would have something like 20,000 drivers, 20,000 different ways in which people could implement that. So there was no great compatibility from one manufacturer to the next, hardware company to hardware company. He would let you do it any way you wanted, as long as you used the Microsoft operating system. And he wanted to sell you shrink-wrapped applications on a disk to run on those computers. So both of them ended up being correct, but they had completely different strategies on how to do it. If you look at Apple today, it follows the same principles that Steve Jobs laid down, over 30 years ago. And those principles are no compromises in the user experience. Apple controls everything, the hardware, the software, the services. And you find that the most successful entrepreneurial companies are the ones that are still led by the founders. Why is that? Well, founders have an insatiable curiosity to solve a problem. They are passionate about it. The most successful founders are excellent communicators to attract other talented people to come and work with them. They rarely have any money when they start. Just as Steve Jobs and Bill Gates never talked about making money, when they started out with no money. So if you're an entrepreneur and you're thinking about starting your own company, or you've already started your own company, and you look at these giant companies like Microsoft and Apple, I knew them when they were little tiny startup companies, not giant companies. It's going to happen again. There will be companies that will start with individuals. Some of you may be those individuals. That starts with an idea. It starts with a curiosity. It starts with a passion. It starts with a willingness to try things and make mistakes. Here's what's really a surprise to a lot of people. You rarely ever learn anything from your successes. In fact, if you look at the big companies that have been successful, they often are the ones who make the biggest mistakes when the next generation of innovation opportunity comes along. I'll give you a perfect example. We all know today that the future is all about mobile devices, mobility. And yet, both Intel and Microsoft, who hire extraordinarily talented people, both of them missed the first era of mobility. They dominated personal computers, Intel with the chips, Microsoft with the operating system and with the application suite of Office, yet they both completely missed the first era of mobility. Or you may remember a company called Kodak. Kodak dominated the film industry and photography. George Eastman, the founder of Kodak, 100 years ago, came up with the idea of point and shoot cameras. An incredible innovation 100 years ago, but it was all about film. In 2007, Kodak was concerned about a major competitor, Walmart, who was going very deeply into the film business and selling single-use film cameras through their vast distribution system. And so Kodak chose to double down their investment in film exactly at the same time when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. And the iPhone came out, timing in life is everything in high technology. The iPhone came out exactly at the time when the US wireless industry was moving from 2G, which is about simple text, to 3G, which is about photos. And it was Apple and the iPhone that reinvented photography. And 3 years later, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. So that's why I say you can become a victim of your own success. On the other hand, what makes Silicon Valley so unique is that there are so many role models in Silicon Valley that one can look to for examples. And there is also a culture of tolerance for people making mistakes. Because the people who are taking the biggest risks, trying something that hasn't been done before, the high probability they're going to make a mistake. In Silicon Valley, the first thing we say when someone has made a mistake, we say, so what did you learn? Not, why did you screw up? And there aren't a lot of cultures in the world that say, what did you learn? Rather than, why did you screw up? So what's exciting to me is that I believe that there is already a role model of success that the whole world is looking at here in Nairobi, and that's M-Pesa. People in the US now are talking about Apple Pay. They're talking about Samsung acquiring another company called Loop Pay. They're talking about UFC. They're talking about Beacon, all of these new technologies that are going to be important in payment. But the reality is that M-Pesa is a much larger percentage of the gross domestic product of your economy than any of those new entrants will be of the US economy for probably decades. And so whoever came up with the idea of M-Pesa solved a billion-dollar problem. And as I said earlier, you have to have the curiosity of there has to be a better way. What entrepreneurs do, they're the kind of people who look at everything and they absorb things and they are great observers and they're constantly thinking about, isn't there a better way to create a better product, a better service as a solution? And M-Pesa is a perfect example of that. There wasn't a fully developed consumer banking system in Kenya as there are in other countries, and M-Pesa filled that gap, and it did it incredibly successfully. Now, that doesn't mean that one can say, well, gee, there's nothing left to invent. Quite the contrary. What I've learned as an entrepreneur is that when you solve one problem, it only creates a derivative effect of another opportunity. In the States, I am very involved in the field of consumer wellness and health. We spend in the US $3 trillion US a year, 3 trillion on healthcare. We do not cover all of our citizens yet with healthcare. Many other countries in, say, Western Europe and in Asia give healthcare to all of their citizens. In the US, we spend $3 trillion. We spend twice as much per capita on health, and yet we still don't cover all of our citizens with health. And the inflationary cost of our healthcare system in the US is so great that it is unaffordable going forward. And everybody knows it. The politicians know it, the insurance companies know it, the hospitals know it, the doctors know it, the citizens know it. And so you say, well, there has to be a better way. If you're an entrepreneur, you say, well, there has to be a better way. And one of the better ways, it won't solve the entire health system, but it may solve a piece of it, is what's called the consumerization of health, digital health. And a company I'm involved with called MD Live, we are actually one of the leaders in telehealth in the US. This means virtual visits over smartphones with certified doctors. And the hard part is not the technology. The hard part is the complexity of the regulations we have. Every state is different. There are all kinds of special interests that we have to be able to accommodate. So it's very, very complex in terms of the regulatory and implementation issues. The technology is getting better and better every year and becoming very affordable for very reliable digital health solutions. And because it's the consumerization of healthcare and wellness, it means that you also have to understand how do you market to consumers. The reason I'm interested in it is I have decades of experience in consumer marketing with Pepsi, with Apple, and with many other companies I've been involved in mentoring and investing in, mostly consumer type businesses. I have a lot of experience in technology, over 30 years in high tech, and I've spent the last 8 years in healthcare, learning the domain. So if you want to create a disruptive business, you've got to be able to connect the dots, often across different domains. Doesn't mean you have to be an expert in all of those domains. Like I said, I have experience in consumer marketing, I have experience in high tech, I have experience in healthcare. But one could start a company in consumer health and maybe only have experience in one of those domains as long as you recruited people on your team who did have experience in those other domains. So the other message I would point out to you is that rarely is an entrepreneurial company done by one person. It's bringing together the talents of several people in several different domains, in what's called domain expertise. So that gives you a bit of an overview of why I think there is so much opportunity, and I'm particularly interested in the emerging markets for a very, very practical reason. The practical reason is that all of the growth in the world economy is in emerging markets. And the economic growth in developed markets like the United States, where I live, is largely a replacement industry. So when we decided to go into the smartphone business, we chose not to go to the United States because there are entrenched competitors. It's a replacement industry where smartphones are sold on a 2-year bundled contract of the wireless service combined with the hardware product. And so the refresh cycle of how often people buy a new smartphone is the length of the contract, once every 2 years. The purchase habit in emerging markets for new phones is more than one a year. So if you're in a growth market and people are buying new phones more than one a year, even when you have very respected entrenched competitors, you have some very expected entrenched competitors here in Kenya. Now, one is Techno, the other is Samsung. These are excellent companies. They make really excellent products. And if this was an industry that wasn't growing, and if there wasn't a rapid opportunity to keep selling to people new products, then it would be very challenging for any new competitor to come into this market. But the reality is that it's not just Kenya that is going through growth, but it's all of the emerging markets all over the world. So that's kind of the opening comments I would make, Juliana.
Great, thank you. And speaking of Obi Mobiles, and so could you tell us a little bit more about the global rapid expansion, particularly in emerging markets? And do you pick and choose which countries have an environment that is conducive to this expansion? And if I may tack onto that, what advice would you give Kenya to be a destination for business, like Ireland and some of the other places that you've had experience growing in?
Well, I would say, without going into a lot of details about Obi, that one of the things that was attractive to us coming into it is that we own IT distribution and supply chain companies all over the world. So we have in our other businesses about $1 billion US of annual turnover in IT distribution and supply chain in India and in Southeast Asia. We have another 1.4 billion US dollars in various types of IT distribution, value-added reselling in the Americas. And so we had developed some experience and some confidence of how you manage the costs and complexities of selling products in many different countries. Our team had also built supply chain and distribution businesses all over the emerging markets. So our CEO, who is based in Singapore of our parent company, and our operations for Obi, which are out of Dubai. All of our team are very, very experienced at frugal expense and building businesses in emerging markets. So we didn't start just as engineers, but we started with a lot of experience in emerging markets. The second thing is that we all come at the design side from Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. And so I brought together the original team that worked with me at Apple, the head of product design, who was one of the most successful industrial designers, actually voted the #1 design firm in America. I brought together the former chief marketing officer who worked with me at Apple. And we brought together the skills of design from our Silicon Valley experience with the emerging market distribution and supply chain experience that we have in emerging markets.
Thank you very much. I think you're also an investor in other companies. What is the chief quality that you look for, either in a company profile, or do you tend to look at the individuals that are involved in the company? And if so, what qualities do you look for?
It's always about the people. Always. It's amazing how many good ideas people come up with. And yet, with all the good ideas that people come up with, it's also amazing how few really, really successful companies there are. And so if you start to say, well, why is it there are so many good ideas from so many people, and yet there's this much smaller number of really successful entrepreneurial companies, particularly in the high-tech space? And the answer is, first is it's all about the talent of the founders and the leadership team that starts the companies. And the other is there's a lot of luck. Ask anybody who's been successful as an entrepreneur in high tech, and they'll tell you they were also not only very hardworking, but they were very lucky. And so timing in life is everything. I've seen, I'll give you a good example. Everyone's heard of Google. How many of you have heard of Alta Vista and Ink2Me? Well, Ink2Me and Alta Vista actually had most of Google's technology before Google. So why was Google successful and Alta Vista and Ink2Me weren't? They disappeared. part of the reason is Google had exceptional leadership talent with the two co-founders. They were fortunate to be able to look at the things that worked with Ink2Me and AltaVista and see the things that were missing. What was missing was one very important idea in search, which was called relevancy ranking. And they were smart enough to realize that the real business model for search was going to be advertising. So yes, they knew how to develop the algorithms that could go out and search the web, but so did AltaVista and so did Ink2Me. What they saw differently was relevancy ranking, and so they could see the relevance of how often people from one website looked at other websites, and they ranked their listings accordingly, and then they were able to sell advertising on a bid basis. So people would have to bid for it against that relevancy ranking. So a lot of the first technologies have been developed by someone other than Google, but the intuitive insight and then the leadership to turn that intuitive insight into a business that was a moonshot that changed the world. A moonshot means whatever comes after the moonshot means the world is different than before the moonshot. It's a metaphor well understood in Silicon Valley. So for instance, the first personal computer. The world was different after the first personal computer. It was different after Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web. It was different after Google launched their search. It was different after Steve Jobs created the iPhone. So those were moonshots. And I wrote a book called Moonshot that just came out fairly recently. And here's the one takeaway idea. You said, give us one idea. No more, not two, just one. The one idea is this. We are going through an era of not one moonshot like Google or iPhone or World Wide Web. We're going through an era where there are many, many technologies that are all happening at once, and they're growing at exponential rate of growth. Cloud computing, mobility with smartphones, big data analytics, the Internet of Things. These are all things that are all happening right now. This is not science fiction in the future. It's happening right now. So what's the one big takeaway idea? The one big takeaway idea is this, and it's as important here in Nairobi as it is in Silicon Valley or anywhere else, and that is there is a market power shift as a consequence. And the market power shift is shifting the power from the large incumbent producer companies that have dominated industry after industry, in market after market, all over the world. The power is shifting to the customers, to the consumers. And why is that? Because customers, consumers are paying more attention to the opinions of other consumers and customers than they are to the incumbent brands and products. And that means that you can start out with nothing, and if you have the right idea, let's say it's Snapchat, or it's Instagram, or it's Facebook, or it's Twitter, or it's LinkedIn. Start out with just an idea. And if other people start telling their friends virtually over social media about it, and they promote it, and it goes on, these businesses go from nothing to something. WhatsApp, when it was sold, was less than 5 years old. It had 560 million users and only 56 employees in the company. And that's a perfect example of customers becoming empowered and telling other customers about it. That's the big idea.
Thank you very much. Let's switch so the guys can hear you in the back. Just really quickly, what is your current noble cause, your personal noble cause?
My personal noble cause is that I have been lucky to be at the right place so many times. And I attribute that as much to luck as anything else. I've had a big curiosity. I've always been willing to work hard. And I've said, I've learned things that I want to pass on to the next generation, wherever they may be. They may be in Nairobi. they may be in Brazil, they may be in Vietnam, wherever those people are, because we live in a global society. And it is possible, I believe, for anybody, anywhere in the world, to have a noble cause and to be passionate about it and to be an entrepreneur. And so when I wrote my book, Moonshot, I had written an earlier book many years ago, which was called Odyssey, which was about the adventure I had going from the establishment of corporate America, heading one of the best-known companies in the world, Pepsi, to Silicon Valley, and what that was like and what I learned. Well, now it's decades later, and I'd never intended to write another book, but I said, I think there's some messages here that I have to pass on. So Moonshot is not an autobiography. Moonshot is conversations with entrepreneurs. One of the good things that I have is a huge network of relationships all over the world. And so I got entrepreneurs who were willing to talk to me, not about their successes, about their failures, about the lessons they learned. They don't teach you these things in business school. For example, what do you do when your back is against the wall, you think you're going to go bankrupt? What do? You know, how do you raise capital when you've got a great idea? How do you convince people to come and join you and want to be part of your team? How do you tell your loyal employees after you have achieved proof of concept and you have to move into an entirely different stage, which is the expansion stage, which takes very different skills, that maybe they aren't the right people to take you from proof of concept to expansion? You know, how do you deal with personal failure? These are things they don't teach you at business school. They don't teach you at university. But you do learn when you're getting your hands dirty and you're out working in the entrepreneurial world. And I said, I want to pass the experience of many entrepreneurs that I work with, pass that on to the next generation. That's my noble cause.
We'll queue up now for questions. And who has the first question? All right. Give me a moment.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It's a pleasure meeting you.
Thank you.
My name is Eric, and I work for Intel in Kenya. One question I have for you is, you say mobility is where you see things going. I totally agree with you on that. What's your picture of success for Obi Mobile, and what are the key regions that you're focusing on for Obi Mobile?
Good. Well, thank you, Eric. And let me just say, because I mentioned that Intel had missed mobility the first time. I don't think Intel is going to miss the next time. And I've been watching Intel and I'm quite impressed with what Intel is doing now, because there's something called Internet of Things. And Intel is now one of the leaders in building very inexpensive sensor type products. So they missed the first era. Qualcomm now dominates microprocessors. ARM dominates microprocessors. But Intel is doing a lot of really good stuff for the next era. So let's say they learn from their mistakes. For Obi, we don't need to be as big as Samsung. We don't even need to be as big as Techno in East Africa. What we need to be is successful enough so that we stand out and can support the kind of talent we have on our team, and we can be able to implement Obi across the emerging markets. We hope to be in about 70 countries by the end of this year. So if we can reach a market share similar to what we already have now in the UAE, so it's about a little over 4%, that's a very successful market share for us. Probably doesn't even dent a Samsung or a Techno, but for us, that would be a very, very great accomplishment. We don't even need a 4% market share in some markets. To be successful, we don't even need a 4% market share in a large market like India. But when you look at that on a global scale, that's a very, very big business. Because what are our strengths? Our strengths are Silicon Valley design. Our strengths are global distribution, our frugal expense models, being able to move rapidly, recruiting talented people, being able to put together strong distribution partners, being able to work with wireless carriers. And so we have those kinds of strengths, but it would never even be something I'd ever want to undertake if we weren't in a growth market. My opinion, it's all over in about 36 months. That within about 36 months, that the emerging markets around the world are pretty much going to be determining who are going to be the incumbents that will be able to continue to go on. So if we were to start Obi 4 years from now, I think it would be incredibly hard because other companies would have established their positions and the growth of the industry. Remember, we're going from 2G to 3G, from feature phones to smartphones. And so that's a transition point. And you always want to go into an industry at the moment of transformation. You don't want to be too far ahead of the curve. You don't want to be behind the curve. And right now there's a transformation stage from 2G to 3G, from feature phones to smartphones, and the rapid growth of people wanting smartphones, that it's a very good time, whether you're a successful established company like Techno or Samsung, who I suspect will continue to do very well here, or whether you are a new entrant. Now, not everybody is going to succeed. So we have to work hard if we're going to be successful, but that's our aspiration.
My name is David. I'm a co-founder of a small startup here called Mchanga. One of the things that's really interesting about your experience is that you had a front row seat to sort of the Windows ecosystem, the Mac ecosystem, the App Store for iPhone. And I guess, I think you mentioned earlier you had lunch with Bob Collymore. You know, it's almost 10 years since M-Pesa sort of came to Kenya. And a question that I get asked, and I hear asked a lot, and I think it'd be interesting to hear your answer, is why has there been no massive successes built on top of this really ubiquitous system that makes Kenya very unique?
Well, it's a great question, David. And it's a question that I think is still to be answered, because there should be. If you look at the eras that we've had, not era mistake, but ERA eras that we've had in high tech since the introduction of the World Wide Web. First we had browsers, then we had portals, then we had search, which is a platform. And now we see that we are moving into what I would call the era of infrastructures as a service. So if you look at companies like Uber or Airbnb, these aren't really technology companies at all. These are companies that very cleverly use technology to solve what are called problems that reduce the friction. So Uber reduces the friction of trying to get a taxi when it's raining and you're in an urban area and there's a shift change and you cannot get taxis. So now come back to M-Pesa. So what is M-Pesa? Is it a technology? Is it a platform? Is it an infrastructure? I believe that M-Pesa is, in many ways, not just an app, but it's at the very least a platform. It may even be an enabler of infrastructures. And it is absolutely something I believe will happen. I believe that there will be people who will start to build things on top of M-Pesa. As I said earlier in my general remarks, that solving a problem in one era is usually creating an opportunity in the next era. And so you look at M-Pesa and you say, well, what are all the other things that you could do now that people have, mobility? I mean, we dream of the mobile wallet in the United States, and you've already implemented the mobile wallet, and it's going to expand into more and more areas. It may go into verticals, it may go into agriculture, it may go, into healthcare. It can go into a lot of different verticals. So it's just something that may not have happened in the last 10 years at the speed at which you and others would like to see. But I think it's clear that it's going to happen. Somebody's going to do it. And what makes it pretty exciting for you all to be here at iHub is that you're probably sitting in the room with someone who's going to do it. There's probably someone in this room who is going to be a successful entrepreneur doing exactly what you described. Why hasn't it happened yet, David? I hope that's the way it turns out.
I'm just going to ask for 2 minutes for us to make John some Kenyan tea. So there'll be just a little bit of noise, but then we'll get back to your questions in just a second. A quick commercial break. In the meantime, could I see the hands of the next people that want a question? So we'll go 1, 2, 3. Okay? When we're back. So we'll go 1, 2, 3. I'll give you this in preparation. You got one? Okay. 2. It's on. So while we're waiting,
Well, Juliana,
Yeah.
I want to say that I'm very pleased that, I love the questions that we've had so far, but I'm also very pleased that the several of the next questioners are women.
yeah.
Because I believe that it's never been a better time for women to be entrepreneurs. And I think that each society is different, in terms of exactly how those opportunities are defined. But I believe it's becoming increasingly optimistic for women to play a bigger and bigger role in entrepreneurial businesses. I was in Turkey last year, and I went through a lot of the villages down near the Syrian border, and what's very popular there is micropayments. And I was visiting, they were all women, actually, who were starting companies. And it was just fascinating to see the success rate of it. And what I learned was the reason they didn't fail was that the women became an ecosystem, and they would look out for any other woman who might be on the edge, and they would step in and make an extra little loan or do whatever they had to do to make that woman successful. And that's an indication, I think, of a very, very healthy concept. So it shows that microloans is not just about making money available. It was about creating a whole ecosystem. In this case, microloans have largely been driven with success around the world by women.
Absolutely. And, we try to encourage an environment that is welcoming to everyone, from, both men and women. And one of the things that we're really happy about the iHub is that a lot of women entrepreneurs feel comfortable to be here, and we hope that the men here continue to be supportive. It's really wonderful to have a co-founder who's a woman, because the diversity in thought and experience, I think, helps to build more resilient companies. I'm wondering what your experience has been over the last couple of years in terms of working with women or having women in your board, in the boards of companies that you've worked with.
Well, I think we've moved from an era, at least in the States, where women were token board members to where women have a lot of relevant experience. And more, I see companies, and in fact, it's in my book, Moonshot, where I interviewed quite a few women entrepreneurs, where there's enough experience and talent out there of women, where it's not just a token woman in an organization at the C level, the executive level suite, but many women. And in fact, many of the women companies have a large preponderance of their staff are women. And I think that's incredibly healthy. And today, people can work from almost anywhere they are. Mm-hmm. So it means that women can be able to make the trade-offs between family responsibilities, children responsibilities, and work in ways that just wasn't possible before we had smartphones and internet and other technologies.
Brilliant. I'll have you tea. Yeah. Thank you. And please go ahead, number one.
Okay. Hi, John. It's really great to meet you.
Thank you. What's your name?
My name is Betty.
Hi,
I'm
Becky.
an entrepreneur. Hi. So, with your experiences as an entrepreneur, as a CEO, as an investor, what would you say are the biggest mistakes you made, and what did you learn?
The biggest mistakes are only seeing a problem from one dimension. One of the things I learned with the many years I was associated with MIT on the board of the MIT Media Lab for about 15 years. And I learned something from one of the professors, Marvin Minsky there. He said, you don't really understand something well until you understand it more than one way. In other words, seeing a problem or an opportunity from multiple perspectives is incredibly important. So how do you do that? Well, you get people on your team who have a variety of different experiences, and they're probably going to see the problem in more than one way. So the example I mentioned earlier is a perfect description of this. Kodak hired some of the best scientists in the world. They always would go for the top students in the top engineering schools in chemistry. But the next era of photography was not going to be about chemistry. And so while they had a team working on digital photography, it was kind of like an adjunct, you know. And what I've learned is that if you want to be really successful, you have to have focus and you have to have urgency. And so you cannot treat innovation as a little bit of an adjunct to what you have. And you have to be willing to sacrifice your current business if you're an established company. You know, I talked about Intel a little bit. Let me talk about Microsoft. Microsoft hires brilliant people. Bill Gates may be the best, you know, all-around business strategist I've ever met. And yet after Bill retired from Microsoft, Microsoft continued to focus on Windows. Everything had to be defined around Windows. Well, anyone in technology knows that the boot cycle on a personal computer is a lot longer than the boot cycle on a smartphone. And so expecting people to have a smartphone that would take, you know, more than a minute to go through a boot cycle was just, you know, impractical. And yet Microsoft kept insisting everything had to be Windows. And what was the consequence? Well, they missed mobility. You know, Apple and Google ended up owning mobility. Well, now they're, you know, they have a very talented CEO now, Satya Nadella, and it looks like he's got a more open mind. He's seeing a problem from multiple perspectives. The other thing I would say is people judgment. People judgment is always very, very hard because you need to get the right people on the team that you can trust and they trust you, but the skills are not always the same if you're a startup in the beginning as the skills that you're going to need later on when you're expanding the company. And so being able to make those people judgments is incredibly important. I mentioned why Alta Vista and Inktomi didn't survive and Google did. One of the big reasons is the talent of Sergey Brin and Larry Page, two extraordinarily talented people. You know, why is Elon Musk so incredibly successful and Tesla has half the market cap, 50% of the market cap of General Motors? And General Motors has been around for 100 years. And Tesla's only a few years old. You know, well, Elon Musk is an incredible talent. He attracts other talented people around him. So seeing things from multiple perspectives, connecting the dots. Going for talented people. A talented people attract A talented people. C talented people attract mediocre people. So those things seem pretty obvious, but you'd be amazed at the number of companies that make those mistakes.
Hi,
Hi, what's your name?
I'm Madil.
Hi, Lemuel.
Hi.
Can you stand up?
A startup. So you've repeatedly used the word luck in your talk. And I'm wondering, I might be wrong, luck, for you to have been in all these great ventures, luck is not merely sheer coincidence for you. So at a very personal level, what's this luck? What's your personal strategy to have been part of all these ventures? Thank
Well,
you.
I believe luck is very important. But I believe that you can make your own luck. So how do you make your own luck? You start with an insatiable curiosity. You find that the people with the best luck are constantly curious about things. There may be no initial purpose as to why they're curious about it. That purpose may not come about for months or years later, but they become curious about something. I'll give you an example. When I started at Pepsi, I was the first MBA that Pepsi had ever hired. They didn't know what to do with me, so they put me into a training program of driving a Pepsi truck and working in Pepsi bottling plants and going out at 2 and 3 in the morning and resetting supermarket shelves. And my friend said, "John, this is crazy. Why would you go work for a company that makes you a truck driver and makes you get up at 2 or 3 in the morning to reset soft drink shelves and then go work in bottling plants and they're all dirty and all of that?" And a few years later, I'd moved up through marketing and I was given the opportunity to become the vice president of marketing. I was still very young. I was just 29, just turning 30 years of age. And people said, "Well, how in the world is he going to succeed? Because he's so young." Well, what they didn't realize was that I understood in my brain, I had the picture of every job that one did inside of a soft drink bottling plant. Everything from producing the product to collecting the empties to merchandising the product to opening up new accounts. All of those things I had experienced because they had put me in this training program for the better part of a year, all over the United States in different bottling plants. And so it happened, and this wasn't until years later, I didn't know it when I was curious and going through this training, that we were working on a new package called the plastic bottle for soft drinks. And there were a new kind of sales channel, which was called mass merchandisers. A new company called Walmart was just starting to grow. And I had the chance to work with Walmart and with the new drug chains and the others, because I had been trained as a designer when I was a student. So I started designing the merchandising equipment for Walmart and for Walgreens and other big chains to take advantage of the plastic bottle. And I was able to connect the dots between my experience as a designer, my experience of working inside of distributing products at the bottling plant level, and then my opportunity to eventually be marketing vice president. So I connected the dots between my experience. And so one could say, gee, John was extraordinarily lucky. He got there just when all of these new channels were opening up, and that's absolutely right. But I also made some of my own luck because I understood the problems of merchandising equipment. I personally designed a lot of the new off-shelf display equipment. I personally worked on converting the barcode into an information technology back when it was first launched. So a lot of luck is making your own luck. And if you don't have a curiosity, the chances of you having a lot of luck is not very high. Not everybody should be an entrepreneur. You have to be willing to make your own luck. You have to be willing to make mistakes and fail, because you almost inevitably are going to make some mistakes. And you have to be willing to accept some bad luck too, as well as some good luck. And if that's not how you're made up, if that's not your personal character makeup, you probably shouldn't be an entrepreneur. You probably should do something else.
Hi, John.
Hi.
I'm pretty excited.
What's your name, please?
My name is Eric.
Hi.
Yeah, I work for a blog called TechWiz. So my questions are majorly on your stint at Apple. I read the autobiography of Steve Jobs and loved it. So my first question is, how was it working with Jobs? I remember you described how the relationship was between you two for the first couple of months, and yeah. Then my second question is, do you consider yourself the father of the Apple Store, or the guy who invented the Apple Store? Because they say in the book, after you met with him and had to fly back to, when you met with him, then you had to fly, you wrote an 8-page memo of how they should try and make the, and create in-stores for merchandise that will add value to the customers. So do you consider yourself the father of the Apple Store? Thanks.
Well, first of all, on Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was every bit as brilliant as anything you've ever read or heard about Steve Jobs. No question about it. And Steve Jobs had the ability to create his own luck. He had the ability to connect the dots between different domains. When he created desktop publishing, it was really connecting the dots between his love for calligraphy that he learned as a student at Reed College, which he dropped out of. Connecting the dots between the personal computer. Steve was not an engineer, that Steve Wozniak created with the Apple II. Steve Jobs did not create the Apple II, Steve Wozniak did. And connecting the dots between what he observed when he was invited by Xerox, who had been an early investor in Apple, to come and see their research laboratories in Palo Alto, and he saw $80,000 engineering workstations that were using graphics and mice and things that he said, gee, you can connect the dots, and what if you made something as inexpensive as an Apple II that had the ability to print with laser printers, because they were using laser printers for engineers at over $100,000. If you could get inexpensive laser printers and inexpensive graphics-based computers, but not for engineers, but for non-technical people. And he was the one who created the personal computer as a tool for the mind for creative people. That was desktop publishing. So that was the brilliance of Steve Jobs. And you saw those same principles again and again, whether it was iPod or iPad or iPhone. So definitely a genius. But he was willing to compromise everything else. He was willing to compromise his personal life and to make the trade-offs and say, making a dent in the universe is more important than anything else I'm going to do on the planet. And of course, he did make a dent in the universe. Now, in terms of the Apple Store, we had started Apple stores when I was there, but we didn't sell them to anyone but our own employees. So I can take no credit for the Apple Store we have today. It's a brilliant conception. And in my book, Moonshot, I talk about the power shifts to the customer. And the way that's expressed in terms of opportunity is that we now have technology that can give customers exceptional customer experience. Apple does it in the Apple Store. Amazon does it when you buy e-commerce online. Uber does it when you order an Uber car. There are many, many examples of exceptional customer experience using digital technology. We're trying to do it at MD Live with telehealth. At the same time, it is now an era where we see the merging of physical retail and e-commerce. And if there was an opportunity for new companies, it's in that space between physical and e-commerce. So for example, if you look at some of the most valuable new companies, they are courier service companies. In India, Flipkart, a relatively new company, has a market value of $12 billion. And it just received $2 billion of funding. And what does it do? It has 40,000 people who do nothing but deliver products to people and collect money. Now, here's a problem that's unique to, certainly it's a real problem in India. You'll have to judge whether it's a problem here in Kenya. But the problem in India is when someone orders something on e-commerce and they want it delivered to their home, there is no home address as we're accustomed to in the US. Here's my street number, here's my apartment number. What someone will say is, I live 3 doors down from the tire shop. And so someone says, well, how in the world do we find you if you live 3 stores down from the shop that sells tires for automobiles and bicycles? And then you have to be able to not only find that person and deliver the product, but you have to be able to collect the money, because in India, they don't use credit cards very much. Everything is COD, cash on delivery. And so you have to find someone who you can trust, who will find the store, find the customer, deliver the product, collect the cash, bring it back. And so courier services are becoming incredibly valuable. And there are ones in the US as well. Instacart is an example of that in a very developed market. So if I were an entrepreneur, I would be looking at how do you take M-Pesa, which is a payment method, and begin to think of it in the context of a delivery service, which is delivering things to people. Now, you don't have the problem of collection because people are doing it on their mobile device, and that's well understood. But you still have the physical issue with e-commerce of how do you deliver the product. And more courier services are saying they can deliver the product the same day. And in some markets, it's now saying we can deliver within 2 hours. So imagine if you thought about M-Pesa as an infrastructure for a service, something you wanted to build on top of it, David. And you said, I want to create a courier service that uses M-Pesa, and the payment side is solved, but now I've got to build the infrastructure side, which is people going out and delivering products. So there are lots of opportunities. Some of them springing out of the lessons learned with Apple stores, which is a beautiful experience. I can't take any credit for it. It happened after I left Apple.
So you can get a chance to sip your tea. Do you have one question that you'd like to hear from some of the young entrepreneurs, and then we'll start taking questions? Just something you're curious about.
Well, I'm curious about how confident are you that you can build a company or join someone else's entrepreneurial company? You don't have to necessarily be the founder. You can be in an entrepreneurial company and not be the founder. How confident are you that over the next several years that you're going to be working in or founding, either one, an entrepreneurial company and creating and building out a product or service that is going to solve a really important problem, and that you're going to be able to do this right here in Nairobi?
I'll invite Joel to answer that question and then ask his question.
Thanks, Juliana. My name is Joel. I run a startup that builds software to simplify access. To simplify access to African financial markets. Mm-hmm. It's extremely convoluted, has a lot of paperwork required, very archaic processes, and payments really is just, they just haven't accepted or got to the level where they can actually take online payments.
Yeah, and Joel, what stage is your company at? How many employees?
We're very early stage. We're at 7 employees right now.
Yeah.
We just closed seed round.
Good.
Local investors.
And have you released a product yet?
We did a prototype, which helped us raise the money, but we're rebuilding that from the ground up for scalability.
And if you were to summarize, what is the big problem, big customer problem that you believe you can solve?
Ease of access to information and the actual markets. So getting the money into the markets is usually one of the most difficult things. Some of the use cases or stories that because I've been doing this in the market about 10 years now, previously ran the largest financial consumer site in Kenya called PesaTalk. Spectacular failure, which I think is one of the things that I think makes me very confident about building something, because I've been there, it's failed, still here, starting again, starting afresh. Some of the stories we hear, for instance, is Kenyans sitting in the US who'd like to make investments back home, because we have a very, very large diaspora community, and we've seen that some of the largest inflows, actually Kenyans sending money back home is significantly higher than foreign direct investment coming into the country. And a lot of it tends to go into, aside from just supporting families, they're trying to make these investments. So we're building that kind of access that will allow somebody sitting in say, Washington, D.C., just to pull out the Visa card and buy Safaricom shares without necessarily having to.
So your product will be for more than the Kenyan market, it'll be for other markets too?
It's global.
Yeah.
Also, we have hedge funds who are looking at getting data out of the Kenyan markets, but the way it's structured here, everybody's using XBRL. We, extensible business reporting language, nobody is doing that here. So we're trying to build that interface between also global players and local markets. So if we can aggregate and get this information out to, say, a hedge fund that's sitting in the US that would like to buy shares, and we see a lot of this. Everybody's heard of M-Pesa. They want to invest in M-Pesa, so they go look for M-Pesa Limited on Bloomberg, and they can't find it. So it's that kind of information that we're trying to pull out and make very simple and plug it into this kinds of places where people will be able to.
Good. Sounds like a very good idea.
Thanks. I'm glad to hear. Reading about you on Wikipedia and across different places, I mean, one of the most fascinating things was to see that you were the youngest VP at PepsiCo for marketing. I think at the time you were picked at 30. And today, at least, get to hear that you were the first ever MBA. And you mentioned it was a lot about luck. But somewhere further down, I read about your brothers, and one of whom was, the CEO at H.J. Haynes, and the other was a CEO at J.P. Morgan, a private investment, I think.
One brother was the CEO of J.P. Morgan Worldwide Private Bank, and the other brother was CEO of H.J. Heinz USA.
Which are both, all three companies that you've all worked in are number one in their space. What is it about your upbringing or your childhood or where you were from? I mean, what was in the water where you are that led to this kind of success? So we see whether we can get Nairobi City Council to add you to our water here as well.
Well, we were brought up on a small island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean called Bermuda. It's the last of the British colonies. Hong Kong and Bermuda were the two last. Hong Kong is now part of China, so it's only Bermuda left. And we were brought up in a very simple lifestyle. As a child, we had no refrigerators. We had what was called a wire safe that kept the cockroaches and spiders out. We had a lot of banana trees, so the spiders loved the sweet bananas. I don't know if you have that here, but I'm sure you do. And we had a goat with goat milk. It's horrible tasting, but I like goat cheese. But we grew up in very simple, clear values. We were sent away to America to school. So we were sent to boarding school. I went away at 11. My next brother went away at 9. It was a very British thing to do in those days. And we were always brought up with a great work ethic. So we were always felt that working hard at something was important. Our parents died when we were fairly young. So my brothers and I largely looked out for each other, and we're extremely close to this day. We still work together on many projects and even involved in some of the same companies. But I think it all comes down to simple principles of life, hard work, good values, and still a lot of luck. Still.
Thank you very much. We have 5 more minutes, actually 10 minutes. So anyone else with a burning question? One.
Hi, John. My name is Moses Kioko. We're running a consulting company here called Mobidev. I'm really honored that you've made time to come and see us. Every time I look back at your story with John, with Steve, I think about how Steve walked to you and was like, "Hey, Mr. Sculley, why don't you come and work for my company?" And there you are. You're very successful. You're running a very successful company, and you're leading it at that point. And now you have to move from a very secure position into a company that is not assured to become successful. How or what got to the point where Steve said, "Come work for me," and you actually thought, "I think this is a good thing I'm going to do, move from my company and go work for this young guy"? It's like me walking over to Safaricom, tell Bob Collymore, hey, Bob, I want you to work for my company. Just
Well, that's a good question, and it has a story to it. The story is that the best job I ever had when I worked at Pepsi was the job of not selling Pepsi-Cola. People think of that because we were very successful of it, but the best job for me was when I was asked to go start Pepsi's international snack food business. Pepsi owned a company called Frito-Lay, which was the #1 snack food company in the US, but had never been sold outside the US. And in the early 1970s, all of the profit from snack foods came from corn snack. So potato snacks, potato crisps, were the anchor to the snack food industry. It was the majority of the revenue, but the majority of the profits came from the corn snacks. There was one problem, and that is that in those days, corn outside the US was what you fed the animals. People didn't eat corn. It was animal feed. So the challenge was, how do you sell animal feed in a different form and build a profitable business out of it? So I was given the task to go start this new business for PepsiCo. And I said, can I hire anybody I want inside the company? And I said, I only want people who are young, because they're going to be away from their homes most of the time. And so I'm just interested in people who are under 30 years of age. And they said, sure, you can have that. And then I said, can we, if we're successful, will you give us access to investment capital only if we can assure you that this is a good thing to invest in? And they said, yes, we think there's a big future here. And when I got those commitments from my bosses, then we started out in the emerging markets. We didn't go to the developed markets. So we went to Brazil, we went to Argentina, we went to Venezuela, we went to Mexico. We went to Southeast Asia and various places. And first, from a product standpoint, we came up with flavors and never talked about corn, the ingredients. We always talked about the flavor of the snack. So when we were selling in Asian markets, it was seaweed flavor, or octopus flavor. And when we were selling in Mexico, it was called chicharrones, which means pork flavor. And so just always corn, but we reflavored it and made it look like something other than corn. So I learned from that experience what it was like to start something from scratch, because we started with nothing. We used used equipment. We flew on the cheapest air flights we could. We would stay at the cheapest hotels, and we said, we're going to behave like it's our own business until we build it to be profitable. We didn't want to fly around like the other executives did at PepsiCo at that time. And so I remember in Brazil, we had 43% devaluation. We had 27% inflation. Interest rates were running over 25%. Government controls were on everything to get the extruders into the country to make our corn snacks. We had to basically smuggle them in parts in our suitcases through various trips and then reassemble them once we got into Brazil. We would buy used equipment in the US and refurbish it and bring it into these different markets because we couldn't afford to buy new equipment. We were really entrepreneurs. And so from that, I built a self-confidence that going to Silicon Valley couldn't be any more risk-taking than the things I'd had to do when we were starting our international snack food business in the emerging markets. So that gave me self-confidence. Nevertheless, Steve Jobs and I spent 5 months getting to know one another. Every weekend we would get together, either in California or in New York. And finally, in the end of March of 1983, Steve and I had spent an entire Sunday together walking around New York, and I was taking him through the Metropolitan Museum of Art and showing him archaic and archaistic sculpture because I knew something about it, and I wanted to see how he would respond to something I knew he knew nothing about, and I knew something about. And then he loved music, so he took me to Tower Music, where they were in those days selling music still on 8-track tape, if you ever heard of anything like that. And so we finally ended up at a new apartment he just acquired at the San Remo Palace on Central Park West. And as the sun was going down and we were standing out on the balcony, I turned to Steve and I said, Steve, I really love the friendship we're developing, but I'm not coming to Apple. I'll advise you for free. I said, it sounds fascinating what you're doing, but I think I belong here. And there was this long pause, and there was no one more adept at negotiating than Steve Jobs. Yeah. So you've heard about his skills of performance of selling, his skills of getting people to create great products, but there aren't as many well-known stories publicly as Steve Jobs, the negotiator. And so he stood there and he had his running shoes on like this and blue jeans. And in those days he had jet black hair, jet black eyes. I remember he was only 27 years old. And he looked down at his running shoes for the longest time, and I'm just standing there. And he's looking there and he's not saying anything at all. And it just seems like it's going on forever. And then finally he looks up at me, and we're about that far away from each other. And it's eye to eye. And he says, do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? And that's how Steve Jobs recruits and sells. And so, having just turned him down, I didn't say yes, but a week later I was an employee at Apple.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
So my name is Kamal. I run a company called Craft Silicon.
Yes?
I have my views, but I wanted to ask you, Silicon Valley has given up many multi-billion-dollar companies. Africa and Kenya has not given any company of that nature. What do you think? Do you think something like this is going to happen?
I think what you need are role models. And M-Pesa is a role model. So it's been around for 10 years. But so what? It's still a great role model. But the rest of the world is just catching up to the importance of mobile payments. So think of it as a platform. Don't think of it as an app. And by the way, you don't have to build the next M-Pesa. There are plenty of big, juicy problems to solve out there. But it starts with a curiosity. It starts with a passion to solve a problem in a unique way. It goes on to having a focus that nothing will get in your way, and an urgency to get it done as quickly as you can. And I don't see any reason why you can't have some great successes. Will they be billion-dollar successes? Who knows? But you don't have to have a billion-dollar success to be very successful. And what you need here are role models. One of the interesting opportunities for iHub is it's an incubator to bring people together, to learn from each other. You'll learn more about what it takes to become an entrepreneur by being around other entrepreneurs than you will in university or business schools or even working in large companies. So what you're doing here with iHub may well see an outcome with a successful company. Whether it's a billion-dollar company, who cares? You don't have to be a billion-dollar company to be very, very successful, and a role model for others to follow.
And on that note, I'd like for you to please stand up and do join me in thanking John for his attention, his insight, and for spending this evening with us. It's truly an honor. Please join me in thanking him.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to invite the executive director of the iHub, Josiah, to do a quick vote of thanks, and then we'll ask the photographers to go up there. Instead of doing a bunch of selfies, we'll just look up there and take one giant picture for all of us. Is that okay? All right.
Thanks, guys. I don't know how much you've learned today, but I think I've gotten a ton from his experience. One thing that stuck out for me was connecting dots. You repeated it, I think, like 5, 6, 7 times. I was actually counting. So I think that's a big lesson for me. We shouldn't live in silos. We should try and connect things from different disciplines, from different backgrounds, different people, and then figure out how to build companies. And just one other remark, Kamal is running by Kenyan standards, one of the larger tech companies. So we're really happy to have you around, Kamal. There's tea after this, tea and some cakes, I think, thanks to Obi Mobile and Despec. Yeah, I think we can take our picture. But thank you guys for coming. Thank you for spending time with us, with your wife, Diana, and the team from Obi Mobile.
If I can just mention 2 more things. Number one is we have set up an Obi Ventures group, and very selectively we're looking at seed investing in new companies. Very selective, so don't everyone come rushing up. You're going to have to sell hard, sell hard. And the other thing, I would say that if you're interested in some of the ideas that I talked about and exploring them more, you can go to Amazon, and the new book I wrote, Moonshot, is available as an ebook on Amazon, or audiobook, or hardcover book, whatever you want. But it's really interesting for me, having gone through the process of writing it, to talk with so many entrepreneurs and learning the similarities of how they think about things, even though they did it in very different industries all over the world.
Thank you. Thank you again for coming and spending time with us. Thank you guys for showing up. And I think you'll just do our massive selfie. That's not a selfie.